On August 2024, Stephen J. Scott, the founder of Starling, a risk intelligence platform, posted what looked like a routine announcement. I'm delighted to welcome Lara Warner, former Chief Risk and Compliance Officer at Credit Suisse, to our advisory board. But within hours, the backlash hit. In the comments, people weren't celebrating. And when you dig into her resume, it gets worse. CFO at AT&T, shortly before a multi-billion-dollar write-down. Senior analyst at Lehman Brothers, before it helped trigger the 2008 financial crash. And then, Credit Suisse, where she spent nearly 20 years and left just after two major financial disasters in 2021. 2 years later, the bank no longer existed. People blamed her. Some still do. But Credit Suisse's fall was never about one person. This is the story of how a 167-year-old banking giant collapsed from the inside. Credit Suisse wasn't just another bank. Founded in 1856 to fund Swiss railways, it grew into one of the most recognized names in international banking. By the early 2000s, it managed over $1 trillion in client assets. Serving the ultra-wealthy around the world, it was widely seen as a trusted institution. Something too big to fail. But something started to shift.
The signs were everywhere, but now it's official, we are in a recession.
After the 2008 financial crisis, competitors like UBS pulled back from high-risk investment banking. Credit Suisse didn't. It doubled down with riskier strategies, and no one stayed in charge long enough to fix anything. Credit Suisse was quietly developing a reputation not for fraud, but for repeated judgment errors. And this wasn't new. Back in the early 2000s, the bank had been fined for helping clients evade taxes. In 2014, it paid $2.6 billion to settle a criminal case with US authorities. Even further back, during World War II, Credit Suisse was accused of hiding assets belonging to Holocaust victims, allegations that resulted in a $1.25 billion settlement. And, in the 1990s, it was linked to laundering money for Japanese organized crime groups, including the Yakuza. So yes, Credit Suisse had their fair share of controversies, and the late 2010s were nothing new. The Spygate scandal in 2019 involved Credit Suisse executives ordering surveillance on former executive Iqbal Khan, who had left the bank for UBS. The private investigators hired to follow him were linked back to Credit Suisse's then COO Pierre-Olivier Bouet, a close associate of CEO Tidjane Thiam. Although Thiam denied prior knowledge, the incident led to his resignation.
I did not order a surveillance of Iqbal Khan, and the notion which has been repeated that for an incident in January, suddenly I got angry in September and lashed out, is just not credible and is not true. So I did not order surveillance of Iqbal Khan.
Meanwhile, risk management, one of the main functions in a modern bank, began showing signs of strain. And this is where Lara Warner enters the picture. Her rise was unusual. No Ivy League degree, just a bachelor's degree in finance. But she climbed the ranks at Lehman Brothers and later Credit Suisse, a rare case in elite banking circles. By 2017, she was one of Credit Suisse's top paid executives, earning a total pay package of 54 million euros. Some even saw her as a potential successor to CEO Tidjane Thiam. In 2020, she was promoted to Chief Risk and Compliance Officer, one of the most powerful jobs at a bank, and was responsible for overseeing all risk exposure. Warner wasn't some outsider. She had spent nearly 2 decades at Credit Suisse. She didn't cause what happened next, but she was at the center of it. In early 2021, Credit Suisse's first major public crisis broke: the collapse of Greensill Capital.
Please understand that I bear complete responsibility for the collapse of Greensill Capital.
That's Lex Greensill, a former banker who built his company into one of the most talked about names in finance. It was so connected that even former UK Prime Minister David Cameron was on the payroll. lobbying for the firm at the highest levels. It was a supply chain finance firm that promised to simplify how companies manage their cash flows by paying suppliers early and being repaid later. Credit Suisse had offered around $10 billion in funds to its clients that were directly tied to Greensill's financing operations. These funds were marketed as safe, but they were anything but that. Internal warnings had reportedly surfaced as early as 2019, but these concerns were dismissed.
Credit Suisse had an independent review conducted of that, and they proposed certain changes to the rules of the fund, but they continued to provide the fund.
And according to reports, Lara Warner personally overruled risk managers who cautioned against giving Greensill a $160 million bridge loan just before a private fundraising round. As Chief Risk and Compliance Officer, she had oversight over these concerns. Her office played a key role in allowing the bank's involvement to deepen. When Greensill filed for insolvency in March 2021, Credit Suisse was left scrambling. For many, this was a wake-up call, but it wasn't the full disaster. That would come just weeks later with Archegos. Archegos Capital Management was a private fund that managed billions for just one man, Bill Huang, and Credit Suisse backed him heavily. It was said that internal risk limits were reportedly ignored. Other banks like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley saw the danger and exited early, but Credit Suisse didn't. When Archegos collapsed in March 2021, Credit Suisse lost $5.5 billion, the single biggest loss suffered by any bank involved. And once again, Lara Warner's name was in the headlines. She decided to resign the same month. Alongside her, several other top executives also stepped down, but the damage was already done. In 2024, she was directly named in a class action lawsuit filed by shareholders. It was said that she had removed more than 20 senior managers from Credit Suisse's risk department. When you bring in a sense of fear into an organization by removing so many people, the culture of the risk is not to say no to the business anymore, said a person involved at the time. Archegos wasn't just a bad trade. It exposed what Credit Suisse had become, a bank that chose profit over caution repeatedly. The fallout would lead to internal reviews, leadership changes, and regulations. 2 disasters in 1 month, and Lara Warner had been connected to all of it. But this wasn't her first brush with controversy. Back in 2016, while serving in a leadership role at Credit Suisse, her division failed to report a suspicious 7.9 million Swiss franc transaction linked to Mozambique's Ministry of Finance. That payment was later tied to the tuna bond scandal, a $2 billion corruption fraud that plunged Mozambique into a debt crisis. Though Warner wasn't involved in arranging the loans, Swiss authorities fined her in 2025 for not flagging the suspicious transaction. But her lawyers denied this, stating the decision not to file a money laundering report was not made by Ms. Warner. Even in 2018, the bank lost $60 million on a short bet against Canada Goose, followed by a $200 million hit when Malachite Capital imploded. To any risk-literate person, it should look like a warning sign. And if you let that slide, what the hell are you even doing? Credit Suisse entered 2022 in rough shape, but 2023 would be worse. In March, Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank collapsed in the United States. Global markets turned nervous, and Credit Suisse found itself with problems again. Its largest shareholder, the Saudi National Bank, publicly stated it would not provide further financial assistance. The impact was immediate. Credit Suisse's share price dropped over 25% in 2 days, and clients rushed to withdraw their funds. The Swiss National Bank stepped in with a 50 billion franc credit line, trying to stabilize the situation. But it wasn't enough. Within days, the Swiss government intervened with an emergency solution. UBS would acquire Credit Suisse for just 3 billion francs. A bank, once valued in the tens of billions, sold for less than a mid-sized startup. In the process, 17 billion francs of AT1 bonds were wiped out completely. It was a forced takeover, designed to stop a full-blown banking crisis from spreading through Europe.
The bankruptcy would have been the highest risk because the cost of the economy would have been huge.
And in the middle of all this, Lara Warner reappeared, not at Credit Suisse, but as a new advisor at Starling, a firm that specializes in risk intelligence. The timing was hard to ignore. The bank where she once oversaw risk was now collapsing, while she stepped into a new role focused on that same thing. After the takeover, thousands of Credit Suisse employees were either cut or absorbed into UBS. And for Switzerland, a country whose identity is tightly linked to its banking industry, the collapse hit hard. Along the way, many names came up. Tidjane Thiam, Pierre-Olivier Bouet, Thomas Gottstein. And while Lara Warner was never the face of Credit Suisse's collapse, her name still lingers in lawsuits and in headlines. But the story didn't end with the merger. UBS, now carrying Credit Suisse's legacy, is facing its own problems. Swiss regulators say it may need to raise $26 billion in additional capital to remain stable. It's also being pulled into lawsuits and continuing to cut thousands of jobs. It looks like the risks didn't disappear. It just changed names. Before her time at Credit Suisse, Lara Warner worked at Lehman Brothers, the firm that triggered the 2008 financial crisis. If you want to understand how that story unfolded, click on this video next.